performance pressure and shaming people about low performance can really just do the trick, can get people to push aside their norms and values and engage in unethical behavior just to get out of being shamed.
This is Parsing Science, the unpublished stories behind the world's most compelling science, as told by the researchers themselves. I'm Doug Lay.
And I'm Ryan Watkins. In the fourth season of the American version of the television show The Office, regional manager Michael Scott is to be deposed as part of a wrongful termination lawsuit filed by the corporate supervisor Jan Levinson. Michael brags that he has memorized Jan's answers to the opposing counsel's questions. She hedges to the camera saying, "The truth is very, complicated, so we went over it carefully, just not to leave anything up to chance or Michael's judgment." Today we're joined by Niki Nieuwenboer from the University of Kansas's School of Business. She'll discuss with us what her research says about middle managers who corrupt upper management's business directives by intentionally misrepresenting them to their employees.
This episode is sponsored by We Share Science. When researchers are curious about what is happening in science, they go to We Share Science to explore video abstracts uploaded by other researchers. You can search their vast catalog of video abstracts to learn about the latest scientific findings, or you can share your research with the world. Whether your research is in progress or already published, at We Share Science, you can share your science and grow your impact. Explore the world's research at WeShareScience.org. Now, back to Parsing Science.
Here's Niki Nieuwenboer.
Hello, I'm Niki Nieuwenboer. I'm originally Dutch. My last name, it translates to the new farmer. And so I guess my family wasn't the old bunch, but the new bunch in town. I lived in the Netherlands most of my life. So I did my my undergrad and stuff in Leiden University in the Netherlands. Then I lived in Belgium for a little bit. I moved back to the Netherlands, did my PhD in Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University. When I moved back to the Netherlands, I already knew that I didn't want to stay in the Netherlands. At the time, I thought I wanted to move to Portugal. So this is where I met João, the second author, who was the person who collected the data. But by the time that I actually got my PhD, I guess I'd fallen out of love with Portugal. So I decided to move to, I applied for a bunch of jobs and I got my first job in California in Santa Clara University, which is in Silicon Valley. And then I decided not to stay there. At least in our field, it's basically you go where the job is. And so Kansas had a job. And when I got here, Lawrence, the town that the KU is in, is just a really neat town, and I like the people here. The Midwest is very friendly, so I decided to move here. And I've been at KU since 2014.
Niki's study set out to understand work routines, specifically those involving middle managers' translation of upper management's directives to align employees' performance expectations. Ryan and I wondered how such misrepresentations, which she calls corruptive routine translation, come about.
The focus was on middle managers and what they did to get employees to behave unethically. And so how we explained what they were doing, that took a long time to figure out, in part because I had to sort of get acquainted with an entirely different literature. Finally, the story clicked. The literature that we were able to use to explain what these guys were doing is referred to as the routines dynamics literature, and it understands routines to be a pattern of work. And so it doesn't so much have to do with mindless repetition as much as understanding that a routine is just a pattern of work that you repeat, if you will. So finally, I figured out that what these managers were doing was creating new work routines for their subordinates, so for the desk salespeople. They were supposed to be salespeople, but the selling wasn't going well. And so they redefined how these guys did their jobs, and that is the concept of corruptive routine translation. Upper management in the abstract already has some expectations about how work gets done. So upper management typically prescribes on a very high level, roughly what you're supposed to be doing. Namely, they're supposed to be selling stuff to corporate customers. And then that routine gets refined and translated as you move down the hierarchy. So everybody everybody gives a different interpretation of the routine and adapts it to their strengths and their weaknesses and their local customs and cultures and all of that type of stuff. And so this translation process, middle managers just hijacked it and said, let's just pretend we're selling, but we're not really selling. We're still telling upper management that we're selling, but here you go, you be a service manager, you do that instead. Or, there's rules, part of this performance management routine, there's rules about what you should report as a call that you made, and they had goals for how many calls they were supposed to make every day. But now we're going to say, you can also log emails as calls or internal calls to other departments within our organization that you do on behalf of a client, like in trying to solve a problem for that client, log that as an external sales call. And so they basically just took what upper management at a high level sort of imposed upon them and then twisted it so that it enabled them to report excellent performance while they were in fact not performing much at all.
Niki's study uses data previously collected by João Cunha, a Portuguese-born researcher now working in France. His earlier research involved a sales staff within a large telecommunications firm. Doug and I were interested in hearing how they developed the idea to examine evidence of deception presented in João's dataset.
As far as I understand, he has always wanted to do an ethnography as a method. He is really drawn to this participant observation type of method. And so he obviously also has an interest in how do people use technology in their work. He was looking for an organization to do an ethnography in, and they found this larger organization, which is a telecom organization, that had just adopted this new technology which helped people track sales. So it was both sort of like a sales tool that you could use to have all your client information and all that kind of stuff as a performance management tool. And so they managed to persuade that organization to allow him to do this study there. And then he spent 15 months there watching people work. And so he got there not anticipating anything unethical to happen or to, it wasn't part of his original research objectives or study. But then when he got there, he just found that people were, being made to lie about their performance. So then he thought, oh, that's interesting. So then he basically just started, observing that too and making notes and asking people in interviews that he was doing. So that's sort of how how he ended up there. So it was not premeditated to be an ethics study. And so he is still very much a sociology of IT person, but yeah, I mean, he wasn't stupid. He thought this is probably interesting and that might lead to a publication. So let's pay attention to what people are doing. So as soon as I started talking with João about these data, I intuited that the most interesting, or one of the very interesting aspects of the story was how the heck do middle managers get people to behave unethically? Because it turned out that a lot of these people were like, yeah, we don't think it's cool. This is not how I want to do my job. This is like people are miserable about having to engage in unethical behavior.
We asked Niki about the setting in which João's data were collected, including how the organization was structured and what the responsibilities of its various departments were.
Obviously, any names and things like that of units and organizations that I'm using are made-up names, pseudonyms, because we cannot disclose the true identity of this organization. But the overall organization, which is a telecom organization, we call it Teleorg. Teleorg, as such, has about 10,000, or at the time at least, had about 10,000 employees. We focus on one unit, which is all the way to the bottom of the organization. We call that unit desk sales. Desk sales was a business-to-business sales channel. They were trying to sell telecommunications equipment, for instance, headsets and telephones and even ADSL lines at the time, to other larger companies. So there was was a business sales channel also that focused on smaller companies, but desk sales was set up to focus mostly on companies the size of like your average Fortune 500 company. So they were selling to these really large clients. And so it had a sister department also called field sales that sold to the same clients. And the difference between desk sales and field sales was that desk sales was supposed to sell, the less complex things and cheaper products, if you will. And they were doing that over the phone, hence the desk sales, whereas field sales was dealing with the same clients. And so desk salespeople and field salespeople often were on account teams together because they were serving the same clients. So that's one thing. Then the primary focus in our paper is on the interaction between middle managers and desk salespeople. And the middle managers were their low-level managers, and the general manager of the desk sales units is also a middle manager. And we kind of generalize, talk about upper managers as anybody that's higher than that. Upper management is essentially where the performance expectations were coming from. They did the goal setting. They were interested in making sure that the desk sales performed well, because it has been set up to cut the cost of their sales channel. So desk sales was a new unit, and because they were selling over the phone, they were much cheaper than field salespeople. So they could reduce the amount of field salespeople, replace them with desk salespeople, and have a cheaper way to sell stuff to companies. So I guess those are the main actors or groups within our organization. We also have some sort of departments that play a role, like the service department and the IT department, because some of the unethical behavior involved them in a way as sort of bystanders, if you will. But the big group is salespeople. They were the ones that were being forced to cheat, and they were being forced to cheat by their middle managers. And the middle managers did so because it turned out that desk salespeople were not really good at selling. And it was a very challenging scenario for these middle managers to get the unit to be a success.
Niki defines corruptive routine translation as a process in which middle managers identify structural vulnerabilities in the organization, which they exploit to create and enforce a lower-level routine that both enables and sustains deceptive performance among their subordinates. We wanted to learn how this routinization of deception comes about in the first place.
So yeah, it starts with upper management setting, performance expectations, or determining sort of like high level or an abstract version of a performance routine. Amongst others, they do so by just having a desk sales unit and a field sales unit, and saying both of them should focus on the same clients, by saying that desk sales should sell from the desk. So they determine already a lot of how work gets done on lower levels, right? So it's not just the actual performance targets, but it's also simply having a desk sales unit and saying they should sell from the desk and sell by phone, I mean. And so yeah, that's sort of upper management role. But also what they said, you have to use this IT system, and you have to report on all those kinds of things that they do to determine what type of behavior essentially should happen on lower levels of the organization. Because that's what upper management likes to do, right? They don't just say go and work, but they want to have some kind of influence and control over lower levels of the organization. So they do so by prescribing how performance gets done. And then the middle level receives that, but they're sort of caught in the middle, because then they have to translate that to actual performance in their lower level employees, and that's where problems started arising, because with all the prescriptions that upper management had made, and so it was really hard for the lowest level of the organization to actually carry out and those prescriptions and reach the targets. In part, it was because the targets themselves were high, and so that was a cocktail that was toxic enough for the middle managers to decide, it's not going to work in an ethical way, and so we're going to make it work in an unethical way.
We were interested in hearing examples of the sorts of deceptive behaviors that desk sales employees engaged in, as well as the extent to which others were complicit in their deceptions.
It's a silly example, but desk sales had to make 7 calls a day, but they only had very few contacts. So ultimately, if you have 7 calls a day, 5 days a week, with the contacts that they had to call the same people several times a week. And that's who does that? Plus, they had to make those 7 calls even if they were sick or in training or on vacation, which is somewhat silly. And so the targets themselves were high, but there were also other things that made performance difficult that were, sort of the quote-unquote fault of upper management, including that the IT system was just hard to work with, didn't go very fast. They also had to log a lot of information in that system about the clients and stuff like that. And we call it onerous administrative requirements. And then anytime that a customer was looking to place an order to replace some things before desk sales, they were supposed to do that with service. But service wasn't incentivized to, they didn't have any sales goals because that didn't make sense. So yeah, the middle managers had figured that out and figured out that sometimes these service people would then also not claim those orders in the system. So desk sales managers actually developed like little IT protocols to search for orders that they could claim as their own. And service was just not paying attention to orders disappearing because they were that was not their job, and they still had complaints to deal with, so they had other things to do. And then also what middle managers also noticed, that's where sort of the squeeze came, is that desk salespeople were just not very good at selling. And so they redefined what certain rules were. You don't have to actually make a call to log a call in your system. They said also, if you log an order as a sale, make sure that you log it first as a sort of a tentative sale, a possible sale in the future. Have some time lapse and then only sort of close the sale after a few days, because sales don't get made within an hour. It's a process. You call the client, you say, hey, are you interested? And then, I'll call back tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. And so they thought if you record orders as sales like in one go without this sort of time lapse that you allowed, then that will look suspicious. And so they made sure that how the data were recorded in the system, that looked like actual honest sales.
Surprisingly, though they benefited from the deception, more than a few employees in desk sales resisted middle managers' plans to game the system at teleorg. Middle managers, however, saw this merely as another constraint to overcome, as Niki explains next.
A lot of the desk salespeople were like, we don't want to lie. We don't want to act dishonestly. We think this is, this is fraud. We don't agree with this. And so in order to overcome this resistance from the desk salespeople against cooperating with this deceit, they were mainly focused on shaming people about low performance. So, you were letting down the team. They had like public rankings on whiteboards that they would shame, the lowest person with the fewest calls made and stuff like that, and they would just highlight underperformance to a degree that people felt embarrassed and uncomfortable about not performing well, and so that is what ultimately sort of motivated a lot of the desk salespeople to cooperate. It was not so much because they were, they could gain bonuses. It was mostly because they didn't want to lose their job and they didn't want to be shamed about not performing well. So it was kind of like a golden cage, if you will. A lot of people think that you can incentivize people, you can pay people to engage in unethical behavior, and certainly we know that sometimes happens, but I think we overestimate the degree to which people can be bribed into unethical behavior. And a good chunk of these guys, they did not want to cooperate. And if you look at the stories that come out of Wells Fargo, it seems like performance pressure and shaming people about low performance can really just do the trick, can get people to push aside their norms and values and engage in unethical behavior just to get out of being shamed. It's, in a way, it's kind of funny, or we have this quote that our PR guy from KU really liked, that if you're approached by upper management in an office party, pretend you're drunk and wander off. It's just kind of funny, but at the same time, if I'm at a party and I don't want to have to worry about pretending to be drunk because I might get into a conversation with a higher level person and I don't want to lie. It's kind of like, we do not wish this upon people, let's just say.
After the recent revelations that Wells Fargo routinely opened phony customer accounts and sold insurance to customers who didn't have to have it, the bank is again back in the news. Now it's because of the Federal Reserve's decision to cap the bank's growth until the Fed is satisfied that it's cleaned up its act. We wondered what Niki thinks that behavior such as Wells Fargo's says about people's willingness to engage in unethical behavior.
So I also teach ethics, right? And so I think it's really easy, and you saw that also in Wells Fargo. It's super easy to blame the bad apple because that means that as an organization, you just get rid of the bad apple. You don't have to worry about, your culture. And so Wells Fargo got rid of like 5,300 bad apples. And so that many people were fired for engaging in bad conduct. And, as I was joking with my students, they really suck at recruiting to hire that many bad apples. So I think it's really convenient to think that for organizations to think it's just bad apples, because then they don't have to change anything about their own model or their own culture, which is always very difficult. It's also convenient personally because we think of ourselves as good people, and of course I wouldn't do something like that, and of course I would be much stronger and resist this kind of dynamic within our context. And I'm not a sociopath, I'm not a bad person, but it turns out that it's really easy to get people to behave unethically. I mean, just look at the Milgram studies, right? In the 60s, people were asked to participate in an experiment, and they ended 65% of them ended up shocking other folks up to 450 volts in some versions of the experiment. And obviously people were unhappy with inflicting pain upon others, but also obviously it was not entirely difficult to get them to do so.
Along with João Cunha, Niki co-authored her paper with Linda Treviño, a distinguished professor of organizational behavior and ethics at Penn State's College of Business. Niki talked with us about the influence that Linda's 30 years of experience with business science scholarship brought to this study.
Both Linda and I, we come from an organizational behavior background, and so I had no familiarity with the literature that we ended up using. So I had to sort of discover this literature. And also, there's some aspects of the paper that when you look at it sort of purely from an OB standpoint, they didn't fit into a nice and neat story about why this was unethical, what these guys were doing. And so I received a lot of pushback on especially the role related corruptive routine translation, the whole be a service manager instead of a salesperson, because a lot of people initially said so they are contributing to the organization and so it's not unethical. But I was like, no, the whole reason why they're being told to be service managers is because it helps them find opportunities to create deceit. So I knew that it was a legitimate part of the story, but I wasn't able to find the vocabulary to justify it. And so at some point, Linda suggested I should look at structural symbolic interactionism, because she had worked on that with her advisor like in the 1980s.
Just a quick interruption to explain that the basic notion of structural symbolic interactionism is that society shapes us and we shape social interactions. For example, how people entering a new group without prior information about one another organize to deal with a task that brings them together. Also, in just a moment, Niki will refer to the ostensive and performative aspects of routines. The prior concerns a routine in principle, while the latter refers to how a routine is actually carried out in practice.
We had noticed that there was a pattern that they were prescribing things to these desk salespeople. So from structuralist symbolic interactionism, I happened upon Latour, and I really gravitated towards this idea of ostensive and performative, which he talked about in this 1986 paper. And then I found the routine dynamics literature, and that's when it all started clicking. And I will say, which is maybe nice to mention, that it has influenced very much my view and understanding of my work and the topic that I research more broadly, in that I'm very much sort of like a social structure kind of behavioral ethics person, which is fairly unusual because our field has been very, very micro experiment based in the past decade or so, and so I'm a little bit of an outlier. I like to look at social structure and human behavior, and how the two combine to produce unethical behavior.
Ryan and I were also curious to know what advice Niki would have for upper management to curtail unethical behavior among middle managers and line employees.
Obviously, we don't know for sure, but I think that if managers had been able to accomplish performance in an ethical way, I think that probably they would have tried to do it ethically. But there were these specific constraints that just made that hard for them. In this case, the constraints were the amount of administration that people needed to do to log into the system, also the system itself, because it was very slow to work with, and so it was very frustrating for desk salespeople to have to log all this type of information. And similar to Wells Fargo, the desk sales unit was actually allowed to operate fairly autonomously, so there was not a lot of monitoring that happened in person. The monitoring that happened was mostly based on performance reports, and so it's easier to lie in a performance report than to have to lie in a face-to-face situation, right? And so I think that was part of what gave the opportunity for unethical behavior, was the monitoring practices by upper management. That I think is an important takeaway for practitioners. Go and visit, look at how people are actually doing their jobs, and maybe go there unannounced, because these visits that did happen by upper management were thoroughly rehearsed at desk sales, so that everybody had the quote-unquote right answers and had their stories straight. So that is an important aspect of the study. Something that we also try to share with people is for upper managers is to be sensitive to the actual practical impossibilities or possibilities of performance, because I think it was because it was just hard to actually produce performance, and because there was a heavy emphasis on performing well, that also, upper management was super obsessed with numbers and making sure that everybody was doing well. It just created the environment that managers thought they had no other option but to make people behave unethically.
Lastly, Doug and I asked Niki what she sees as the big takeaways from her study, both to the field of business management as well as to those who provide leadership within large organizations.
I think there's a bunch of things that we overemphasize or underemphasize that clearly comes to the front. So one thing that in this study and in other more qualitative stuff that exists on unethical behavior that I think is important to start acknowledging is that we have this idea that, people become morally blind and blah, blah, blah. And so it's sort of like an oops kind of version of unethical behavior. Gosh, I didn't know that I was doing something bad. But no, these guys were clearly aware that this was deception, and they were unhappy about it, and still they participated in it. So I think that's an important point. Also, we talk about the normalization of unethical behavior, but when we do so, I think a lot of people understand or think of normalization as normal, and so I don't understand it to be unethical. But I think those are two different things. I think it can be normal because this is how we do things here, right? So it is normal, but at the same time, it's not like I'm not aware that this is also unethical. No, it is widespread. It is the normal way that we do things, but I do know that it is unethical. And I think another thing that is important, and it's not so much in our data because we don't have data on higher level managers, but it might be that some of the higher level managers are aware that there's bad stuff going on, but choose to remain silent. And we also typically, when we talk about upper management, sort of assume that everybody, this is upper management and upper management thinks this. But there might be different folks in upper management that think, hey, this is totally unethical, but makes me look wonderful, so I'm going to happily ignore this. And there might be others that think, no, if I know that this is happening, that I would be very upset with it. So it's not one whole. I think we should just look at and understand upper management in a much more complicated way than we do by just sort of lumping them together as one entity, because they're not.
That was Niki den Nieuwenboer discussing her article, Middle Managers and Corruptive Routine Translation, the Social Production of Deceptive Performance, published on October 3, 2017 in the journal Organization Science. You'll find a link to the paper on parsingscience.org, along with other materials that she discussed during the show.
In a few weeks, the acclaimed researcher behind the Stanford prison experiment, Philip Zimbardo, will be joining us on Parsing Science. He'll talk with us about his striking new research into the dynamics that underlie people's decision to defy unjust authority figures. You can find the paper that we'll be discussing on parsingscience.org under the Coming Soon menu item. If you have any questions that you'd like for us to explore during our interview, leave us a message on our toll-free hotline at 1-844-XPLORIT, and we might feature your call in the episode. That's 1-844-975-6748.
Next time on Parsing Science, we'll be joined by Sam Mayer and Manveer Singh from Harvard University. They'll talk with us about their research into whether a universal link exists between the form and function in human song.
It's a weird finding. It feels fundamental in this way that these two domains of music that you find everywhere that are very identifiable are completely the opposite in their features. It feels important for the evolution and design of music.
We hope that you will join us again.